Harold Bennett sat alone in his living room. The house was quiet. The old clock on the wall ticked in a slow, steady rhythm. The late afternoon light came in through thin curtains and drew long lines across the worn carpet. On the small table in front of him lay a single envelope. It was yellowed at the edges and soft from being handled many times. His name was written on it in his own handwriting, but from a much younger hand. The ink had faded to a pale gray. Harold stared at the envelope for a long time before he touched it. His fingers moved toward it, then stopped in the air. He swallowed, feeling his throat tighten. He had carried this letter for 40 years. He had hidden it in drawers, in boxes, in the back of closets. He had moved houses and towns. The letter always came with him. His chest rose and fell in slow, heavy breaths. He felt the familiar weight in his stomach. It was the same dull knot that had lived there since that night. The night he never spoke of. The night he pretended had nothing to do with him. Finally, he picked up the envelope. The paper felt fragile, like it might fall apart if he pressed too hard. His hands shook a little. He frowned at them, annoyed at his own weakness, and tried to steady his grip. He turned the envelope over. It was unsealed. It had always been unsealed. He had written the letter. He had never sent it. Harold pulled the letter out. The paper made a dry, soft sound. He unfolded it slowly. The first line stared back at him. "My name is Harold Bennett, and this is what I should have done." He read the sentence again. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His eyes felt hot. His shoulders sagged. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. The colors of the furniture faded, and his mind slid back in time. He saw rain, dark trees, flashing lights in the distance, a young woman's face, pale and frightened, a voice calling his name. His fingers tightened around the paper. He forced himself back to the present. The faded armchair, the small TV in the corner, the framed photos of his daughter, Lydia, on the shelf by the wall. Lydia as a child, smiling with missing teeth. Lydia in a school uniform. Lydia at her wedding, holding his arm, eyes full of trust. Harold pressed his lips together. His jaw clenched. He knew what the letter held. Every line was a piece of the truth he had never said aloud. Every sentence was a step backward into a night he wished he could erase. But the years had not erased it. Time had not forgiven him. Silence had not saved him. He read the next line. "On the night of the storm, I heard her calling." His heart beat louder in his ears. He heard the echo of that cry. The sound had stayed with him through birthdays and Christmas dinners, through quiet walks and church services. It had followed him into his sleep. It woke him in the dark. He stopped reading. His hand dropped to his lap, the letter still open. For a long while, he said nothing. He only listened. To the clock. To the faint hum of the refrigerator. To his own breathing, rough and uneven. He was 73 years old. He had less time ahead than behind. He knew this. His body reminded him every morning's stiff knees, aching back, the slow struggle to stand straight. He had told himself that silence was kindness, that there was no reason to reopen an old wound, that no one would be helped by knowing what he had done, or what he had failed to do. But the truth had not stayed quiet inside him. It moved, it pushed, it pressed against his ribs. Some days it felt like a stone, other days it felt like a hand around his throat. Harold closed his eyes. He saw Eleanor's face again, her hair wet from the rain, her lips trying to form words, his own feet frozen to the ground. A low sound came out of him. It was almost a groan, almost a sigh. He did not know which. He opened his eyes and looked at the letter once more. He read one more line, slowly. "I cannot live the rest of my life without saying this out loud." He had written those words decades ago. The next morning, Harold woke before the alarm. Light crept in through the gap in the curtains, soft and pale. His back ached, and his knees protested, as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. For a few seconds, he sat still and listened to the quiet of the house. The envelope from the night before lay on his bedside table now. He had not hidden it again. It sat beside his glasses and his watch, as ordinary as any other object, yet heavier than all of them. He reached for his glasses first. The world came into focus. Then he picked up the envelope, just for a moment, feeling its familiar weight between his fingers. He did not open it. He only nodded to himself, as if to affirm that it was still there, that he had not imagined the decision he had made. He set it back down and stood up slowly. In the small bathroom, he studied his reflection. The man in the mirror looked tired but not weak. His hair was thin and white around the edges. Deep lines marked his forehead and the corners of his mouth. His eyes, once bright and sharp, had grown softer, but today there was a new firmness in them. He turned on the tap and splashed water on his face. The coolness cleared the last fog of sleep from his mind. He dried his face with a worn towel and thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that life could look so normal on the surface, when something so heavy lay beneath. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee from yesterday. Harold filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The flame flickered to life with a small click. While he waited for the water to boil, he opened the cupboard and took down his favorite mug, the one with the small chip on the rim. It had been a Father's Day gift from Lydia many years ago. The words "World's Best Dad" were still printed on the side, though the letters had faded. He ran his thumb over the letters and felt a tightness in his chest. The kettle whistled. He poured the hot water over instant coffee, and watched the dark swirl rise in the mug. He sat at the small table by the window, cradling the cup in both hands. Outside, the street was still quiet. A lone car rolled by. A dog barked in the distance. This town trusted him. People knew him as steady, kind, and helpful. He fixed leaky faucets for widows from church. He drove neighbors to the doctor when their own cars broke down. He carried groceries, trimmed hedges, replaced broken porch lights. He sipped his coffee and thought about how little they actually knew. At 9 o'clock, Harold put on his coat and stepped outside. The air was crisp, with a light chill that hinted at changing seasons. He locked the front door and started down the sidewalk at an even pace. His joints moved stiffly at first, but loosened as he walked. As he reached the corner, he saw Mrs. Patterson sweeping her front steps. She was in her late 60s, small and sharp-eyed, with a scarf tied neatly around her gray hair. She paused when she saw him and lifted a hand in greeting. "Morning, Harold," she called out. "Morning, Ruth," he replied, offering a small smile. "How are you today?" she asked. "You look well." He hesitated only a fraction of a second. "Can't complain." He slowed down as he neared the building. For a moment, he considered going in, speaking to the pastor right then. But he knew the pastor would likely be out, visiting someone or working elsewhere at this hour. And Harold understood that he needed to be ready, truly ready, before he set this in motion. He stopped at the bottom of the church steps and looked up at the entrance. The building had always been a place of comfort to him. Now, it also looked like a place of judgment. He breathed in deeply, then let the air out in a long, slow stream. "Soon," he murmured to himself. "Soon." He turned and resumed walking. When he reached his house, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar smell of old wood and coffee greeted him. He set the groceries on the counter, and put everything away with slow, careful movements. In the living room, he stood by the shelf of framed photographs. His finger traced the edge of a picture of Lydia as a teenager, holding a trophy from a school competition. Her smile in the photo was wide and open. She had always looked at him with clear eyes, full of trust. He felt a mix of shame and tenderness rise within him. His life, from the outside, looked whole. A faithful churchgoer, a helpful neighbor, a loving father. Decades of quiet acts had built a strong image of who he was. But the image was incomplete. He knew that once the truth came out, the people who greeted him on the street might cross to the other side. The pastor might avoid his eyes. Lydia might look at him differently. Yet, standing there in his small, ordinary living room, he understood that the trust others had placed in him was borrowed against a debt he had never paid. The time had come to face that cost. He sat down in his armchair and glanced at the envelope on the table beside him. It lay there like a small, silent witness. The town trusted him. His daughter trusted him. The church trusted him. Now he would find out whether he could still be trusted after telling the truth. Late that afternoon, Harold sat in his armchair, with the television on but muted. The images flickered across the screen: weather reports, news headlines, smiling anchors, but none of it reached him. His mind drifted back to the letter. Upstairs, to the phone call with Lydia, to the quiet promise he had made to himself. A soft knock came at the front door. Harold lifted his head. Visitors were rare on weekdays. He reached for his cane, stood up slowly, and walked to the door. His steps were careful. His breathing felt slightly heavy. He opened the door. Thomas Walker stood on the porch. The sight of him made Harold's grip tighten around the doorknob. Thomas was the last person he expected to see. His hair had turned completely white, and his shoulders had rounded with age. But his eyes were the same: sharp, steady, and uncomfortably direct. "Hello, Harold," Thomas said. His voice was low, steady. Harold swallowed. "Thomas," he replied. "Been a long time." "A very long time," Thomas said. They stood facing each other for several seconds. The air between them felt thick, heavy with things. Neither man had spoken in decades. Finally, Harold stepped aside. "Come in." Thomas entered the house. Harold closed the door and followed him into the living room. Thomas looked around, taking in the framed photos, the tidy shelves, the quiet order of the place. "You've kept it nice," Thomas said, though his tone held no warmth. "I try," Harold answered. He gestured toward the sofa. "Have a seat." Thomas remained standing for a moment, as if unsure whether sitting down meant accepting something he did not want to accept. But then he lowered himself onto the sofa with a quiet grunt, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Harold sat in his armchair across from him. His palms felt damp. Thomas studied him. His gaze was slow and deliberate, as though assessing what kind of man he had grown into. Harold shifted slightly, feeling exposed under the scrutiny. "I saw you at the grocery store earlier," Thomas said. "Didn't expect to run into you in this town." Harold nodded. "Moved back a few years ago. Quieter here." "Quieter than the memories?" Thomas asked. Harold looked down at his hands. "Sometimes." Silence followed. Not a comfortable one. A silence that held weight. Thomas breathed in deeply. "I didn't come to make small talk," he said. "I figured," Harold replied. Thomas leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, before returning his gaze to Harold. 40 years, he said. 40 years we haven't spoken about that night." Harold's jaw tightened. "I know. You know," Thomas repeated, voice sharp. "But do you know what the Price family went through? Do you know what it did to this town? Do you know how many questions were left unanswered?" Rain fell in thick sheets that night in 1984. The sky was black, and thunder rolled across the hills like a warning. In the flash of lightning, the narrow forest trail, lit up for a split second slick with mud, scattered with broken branches, and swallowed by darkness on both sides. A younger Harold Bennett ran along that trail, his breath sharp in his throat. His jacket clung to him, soaked by the storm. His boots slipped on the wet ground. But he pushed forward, drawn by the sound he could not ignore. A woman's voice, thin, afraid, calling for help. "Hello?" Harold shouted into the storm, his voice cracking. "Is someone there?" Only the wind answered. It whipped through the trees, bending branches until they groaned under the weight of the rain. Harold moved the flashlight in his hand from side to side. Its beam too weak against the heavy downpour. He took another step, and his foot sank into a patch of mud. He steadied himself against a tree and listened again, forcing his breath to slow. Then he heard it clearer this time. "Please someone." Eleanor's voice. Harold's chest tightened. He knew her. Everyone in town knew her. Eleanor Price, 22, kind-eyed, full of plans for a future. She talked about with a hopeful smile. He had seen her just a week before, laughing outside the small cafe on Maple Street. He moved faster. The trail curved sharply. Harold rounded the bend and froze. Eleanor lay halfway down a shallow slope, her clothes soaked and her hair plastered to her face. One leg was twisted beneath her. Mud covered her hands and arms. Her pale skin stood out against the dark ground. Her eyes opened when she heard him. "Harold," she whispered, lifting her hand weakly. He scrambled down the slope, slipping on the wet earth but managing to stay upright. He crouched beside her, water dripping from his hair onto his collar. "What happened?" he asked. His voice trembled. "I fell," she said, wincing in pain. "I can't move my leg. I tried to climb up." But her voice trailed off, and she looked at him with desperation. "Please, help me." Lightning cracked overhead, followed by a loud rumble. Harold looked around anxiously. The rain was getting worse. Water ran down the slope like a small stream. "I'll get help," he said. "Someone's got to be close." "No," Eleanor whispered sharply, grabbing his sleeve. "Please don't leave me." Her grip was weak but urgent. Her eyes pleaded with him in a way that made his heart pound. Harold swallowed. His mind raced. He could barely hear his own thoughts over the storm. He looked up the slope. It was steep, but climbable. He could make it back to the trail. He could run to the town. He could find someone stronger, someone who knew what to do. But he would have to leave her alone. In the dark. In the rain. In pain. Thunder boomed again. Eleanor flinched, closing her eyes. Harold opened his mouth to speak. The following Sunday morning arrived with a clear sky. But Harold felt no warmth from the sunlight. His hands trembled slightly as he buttoned his shirt. Each button felt heavier than the last. In the mirror, he saw his own unease reflected back at him. Pale skin, tense jaw, eyes filled with sleepless hours. He took the envelope from his nightstand and slipped it into his coat pocket. The paper crackled softly, like a quiet reminder. At the front door, he paused with his hand on the knob. It's time, he whispered to no one. Then he stepped outside. The walk to the church was short. Houses lined the street, trimmed lawns and tidy porches, creating a peaceful picture that felt painfully at odds with what he was about to do. A few neighbors waved. He lifted a hand in return, but his smile was stiff. The church stood at the end of the block, small, white, with stained glass windows that caught the morning light. Harold had walked through its doors for years. Weddings, funerals, potlucks, Sunday services. It had always been a place of comfort. Today, it felt like a courtroom. Inside, people were already gathering. Children whispered. Adults exchanged greetings. Someone tuned a guitar near the stage. The familiar sounds made Harold's stomach twist. Pastor Grant approached him with a warm smile. "Morning, Harold. Good to see you." Harold nodded. "Pastor," he said, clearing his throat, "may I speak to the congregation today?" After the opening prayer, the pastor's eyebrows rose with mild surprise. "Of course. Is everything all right?" "No," Harold said softly, "but it needs to be said." The pastor studied him for a moment, concern flickering in his eyes, but he nodded. "All right, I'll make time for you." Harold gave a small, grateful nod and walked to his usual seat, near the middle aisle. He sat down slowly, hands clasped tightly in his lap. The envelope in his pocket felt like a heavy stone. Minutes passed. The church filled. Lydia was not there yet. She had planned to visit in the afternoon. Harold felt both relieved and disappointed by her absence. The service began. Hymns echoed through the hall. Voices rose and fell. Pastor Grant delivered the opening prayer. Harold bowed his head, but the words slid past him like distant sound. Then the pastor said, "Before we continue, Harold Bennett has something he'd like to share." The room turned toward him. Harold stood. His legs felt unsteady, but he willed them to move. He walked to the front, each step Harold left the church slowly. The morning sun had risen higher, bright and warm, but he felt none of it. His steps were unsteady as he walked home, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his eyes fixed on the ground. Every whisper from the congregation echoed in his mind. Every look, shock, confusion, disbelief clung to him, like a shadow he couldn't shake. By the time he reached his house, his chest felt tight. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The silence hit him immediately. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, breathing hard, as if he had walked a much longer distance. He went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and stood at the counter without drinking it. His hands were shaking too much. He didn't have long to wait. 30 minutes later, the knock came. Harold froze. He knew that knock. A firm, familiar rhythm. He walked to the door and opened it. Lydia stood on the porch. Her hair was slightly wind-blown. Her eyes were wide and red, as if she had been crying or holding back tears. Her breathing was uneven, and her shoulders were tense beneath her coat. "Dad," she said, her voice tight. Harold swallowed. "Lydia, you weren't supposed to come until this afternoon." "I know," she said, "but people started calling me." Her jaw clenched. "I heard what you said at church." Harold stepped aside silently. She entered the living room without waiting for him. He closed the door gently and followed her. Inside, Lydia stood in the center of the room, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the floor. She didn't speak. The pause stretched until it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Finally, she looked at him. "Is it true?" she asked. Her voice was almost a whisper. "Everything you said." Harold felt his knees weaken. He nodded slowly. "Yes." She took a shaky breath. "All these years," she said, "you never told me." "Not once." "I wanted to," Harold said. "I tried. Many times." "Then why didn't you?" Lydia asked sharply. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Harold's voice cracked. "Because I was ashamed. And afraid." He looked at the floor. "I didn't want you to see me differently." Lydia's eyes glistened. "Dad, you were my hero." The words struck him harder than any judgment from the church. "I know," he whispered. "I told everyone you were the bravest man I knew." She said, her voice trembling. "I believed that. I believed it because you always seemed so strong, so steady." And now she stopped, pressing her lips together as her eyes filled again. "And now I don't know who you are." Harold took a small step toward her. "Lydia, please." "No." She stepped back, lifting a hand to stop him. "Don't. I need to understand this. You left a woman alone in the dark. You walked away from her." Harold closed his eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "I did." "How?" Lydia asked, her voice breaking. "How could you leave someone who needed you? How could you live with that?" His throat tightened so much he could barely speak. I don't know, he whispered. I was young. I was scared. And the fear never left me. Not that night, and not for the next 40 years. Lydia wrapped her arms around herself. Evening settled slowly over the town, turning the sky a muted blue. Inside Harold's house, the light faded even faster. He had not turned on any lamps. He sat alone in his armchair, unmoving, listening to the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. Each tick felt louder than the last, as if it were marking the seconds of a life falling apart. The silence pressed in around him, thick, heavy, almost physical. Once, this house had been filled with sound: Lydia's laughter, echoing down the hallway, Margaret humming in the kitchen, the soft murmur of conversations held late into the night. Those sounds lived only in memory now. Harold leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. His breath came shallow, as if the air itself resisted entering his chest. His hands rested loosely on the armrests, though his fingers twitched from time to time, as if searching for something to hold on to. He opened his eyes again and looked around. The room felt unfamiliar. The beige walls, the framed photos, the 3 books stacked neatly on the side table, everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. His gaze fell on a picture frame sitting on the shelf. It showed Lydia at age 9, holding a fishing rod, grinning proudly beside him at the lake. He remembered that day. The sun, the warmth, her small hand slipping into his as they walked to the water. He stood up slowly, joints aching, and walked over to the shelf. His fingers brushed the frame. The glass was cool beneath his touch. I was supposed to protect you, he whispered to the image, not disappoint you. He set the frame down gently. The ache in his chest deepened, spreading into his shoulders and down his arms. Not a sharp pain, just a dull, heavy pressure. He rubbed his sternum absently as he walked to the window. Outside, the street lamps flickered on one by one. Golden pools of light formed on the pavement. A couple walked past, talking softly. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Life went on, untouched by the storm inside his home. Harold's reflection stared back at him in the glass, older, smaller than he felt inside, worn down by years of carrying what he could not speak. Tonight, he looked like a man finally hollowed out. He stepped away from the window and sank onto the couch. His body sagged with exhaustion. He tried to recall the faces from church earlier that day. Mrs. Patterson no longer smiling. Tim avoiding his eyes. Angela looking stunned. Their expressions floated in his mind like faded photographs. One thought lingered more than the rest. They will never see me the same way again. He folded his hands together and lowered his head. His breath shook. For years, he had built a life of good deeds, fixing fences, repairing leaking roofs, delivering groceries to the elderly, hoping that each act would soften the memory of his greatest failure. But now those acts felt small, fragile, like thin paper walls that could not protect him from the truth. His conscience spoke in a slow, steady voice. You did what you had to do, but now you must live with the consequences. A car passed outside, its headlights sweeping across the living room wall. The brief light made the shadows in the room jump and stretch. When the light faded, the darkness felt even deeper. He leaned his head back against the couch and closed his eyes again. Memories rose unbidden. Margaret, smiling as she stirred a pot of soup. Lydia, age 16, crying on his shoulder after a heartbreak. Sunday morning spent. The next morning arrived without fanfare. Pale light filtered through the curtains, settling softly over the living room where Harold had fallen asleep on the couch. His neck ached, and his back felt stiff, but it was the heaviness in his chest that woke him first. He sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The house was still quiet, too quiet. As he looked around, the memories of the previous day came rushing back: the confession at church, Lydia's tears, the hurt in her voice, the look of disbelief on every face. He reached for the envelope on the table beside him. It lay open now, the letter inside gently folded. He didn't touch it. He simply stared at it for a long time, as if the paper itself could tell him what he should do next. A soft knock sounded at the door. Harold froze. The knock came again, gentle, hesitant. He stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. He walked to the door, each step careful. His breath caught in his throat as he reached for the knob. He opened the door. Lydia stood outside, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. The morning light caught in her hair. She looked tired, her eyes rimmed with faint shadows, but calmer than she had been the day before. "Hi, Dad," she said softly. Harold swallowed hard. "Lydia, I didn't think you'd come back today." "I wasn't sure I would," she admitted. She stepped inside without waiting for him to invite her. Harold closed the door and followed her into the living room. She took a seat on the couch, her posture straight but not rigid. He sat across from her in his armchair. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence was different from yesterday's, not angry, not cold, just fragile. Finally, Lydia sighed and rested her hands in her lap. I spent all night thinking, she said. About what you said. About everything. Harold nodded slowly. I understand. No, she said gently. I don't think you do. Not yet. She looked down at her hands. I kept thinking about who I believed you were. The man I saw as strong. The man who always did the right thing. She lifted her gaze. Yesterday shattered that image. Completely. Harold felt the words strike deep, but he stayed quiet. He owed her that. But, she continued, her voice softening, I also thought about something else. Harold looked up, barely breathing. I thought about the man who raised me, who fixed my bike, who stayed up with me when I had nightmares, who sat in the front row for every school play, even when I forgot my lines. I kept trying to decide which version of you was real. She looked at him steadily. And I realized something both of them are. Harold opened his mouth, but no words came. His eyes glistened. You made a terrible mistake, Dad, she said. A terrible one. And you carried it alone for so long, that it changed you in ways I never noticed. Her voice trembled faintly. I can't pretend it didn't hurt that you never told me. I know, Harold whispered. I'm so sorry, Lydia. For everything. I'm not ready to forgive you, she said. Not yet. He nodded. I understand. But she took a slow breath. I don't want this to be the end of us. Harold's heart stilled for a moment. Then it began to pound slow, heavy, but alive. I don't know how to move forward, Lydia continued. I don't know what our relationship looks like after this. But I want to try. I want to understand you, even if it takes time.